I'm also a Catholic school, so I wrote too much. The nuns would approve. So when I go back and forth a little bit, it's because there's so much. I'll ask you all, if you have questions, to reserve them for the end, and I'll stay after school. We can beat erasers, and I'll tell you what I learned over the years. My name is Russell DeShield Jr. I'm originally from Salisbury, Maryland. And from my appearance and my syntax, you might be able to ascertain when I was born. But I have been a lifelong student of history ever since St. Francis de Sales School started teaching it in third grade. I am not an historian. Historians are scholarly, they're brilliant, they write books. I do none of that. I remain to this day a student, and I will be a student of history probably for the remainder of my life. I earned many years ago a bachelor's degree in history from a well-regarded state school. That was the end of my academia. After that, I took the easy way out and went to law school so I could come home, get a job, and eat. Historians are spare people, and as you can tell, I prospered pretty well.
That must be the lawyer in you.
Anyway, the early 1860s were a tumultuous time in Maryland, and my family lived through it. They fought on both sides of the war between the states. My branch were mostly Confederates, but there were DeShields from the Midwest who were in Indiana and Ohio units. There were lots of DeShields in Virginia, all in Virginia units. Benjamin DeShield was with the 1st Maryland Artillery, Confederate States, that was decimated at Benner's Hill in Gettysburg, and he was captured at Williamsport after General Lee retreated after the conclusion of the battle. He spent the remainder of the war at Point Lookout, where he was re-educated. In my working life as a lawyer, I found that the most important thing in any trial are the facts. You divine the facts, you define them, you present them as well as you can, and you leave the judgment to other people, judges, juries, or you're the jury here. Owing to the judgment that you'll make, or whatever you learn, I'll recite from the facts of the Maryland of 1860 and 1861. And I'm going to cheat because I'm going to start in 1859. How did the crisis of Maryland and its drama unfold? Quickly, very quickly, very decisively. 164 years ago today, just to give you an idea, an example of the immediacy and the quickly unfolding events in Maryland. What happened on this day in 1861? General Benjamin Butler's 8th Massachusetts Militia, which was the second group of federal troops that came through Maryland in 1861, landed in the Severn River on the 22nd. Leveled their guns on the town of Annapolis, and even though they were advised not to land by both the governor and the mayor of Annapolis, General Butler stated that they would land. They did land. On April 23rd, they broke into the Annapolis and Elbridge Railroad storage facility and fixed the train. 8th Massachusetts was made up of a lot of tinkerers, which the North had manufacturing, it had machinists, the South was an agrarian, in the Deep South, one crop kind of economy. And I'm also going to explain that there are 3 Souths. It's not one, it's not monolithic. So what happened that day? General Butler's mechanics had fixed the train. In fact, the train was manufactured in a shop in Massachusetts where one of his soldiers was a mechanic. By the 23rd, Washington had been cut off from the north by the Baltimore riots. That was April 19th, 1861. Think about that. Today is the 23rd. What was the 19th? It was Holy Saturday. It was that last Saturday, the day before Easter. So by the 22nd, there were federal troops in Annapolis. By the 23rd, they had restored the tracks torn up by Annapolis secessionists between Annapolis and Washington, D.C. Abraham Lincoln is remembered as saying, "Why don't they come? Where are they?" That's sort of taken up by some of the people who kept diaries who were close to him. He needn't have been so afraid because Virginia was not going to attack Washington, D.C. There were no plans for that. I can understand his concern, but where did they come from? They came from the northern states. They were militia. You think about this. Since before the Revolutionary War, every state, every colony, then every state had a militia. They were sort of part-time soldiers of varying degrees of drilling and expertise. But they were the bedrock of what became the army whenever the country went to war. Happened in the war with Mexico. It happened in the War of 1812. So the militias were the armed bodies of men in any of these states. The standing army of the United States at the time of the beginning of the war between the states was about 20,000 men. If you look up, and you can look up Wikipedia, National Park Service, whatever, you'll find out that the estimate of the people who were under arms by both sides was in excess of 3.1 million people. That's a lot proportionally from a nation that only had 28 million in its entire population. Now, Benjamin Butler was repairing tracks leading to Washington. On this day, the Unionist governor of Maryland, Thomas Holliday Hicks, had feared an open revolt. Hicks and Abraham Lincoln kept Maryland safe for the Union. I'll get into that further. But he had death threats. He thought that the state would rise up and have sporadic secessionist activities. He didn't want to have anything to do with that. He was also scared for his life. He called the state legislature into special session on the 22nd of April. It was to commence on April the 26th. Originally in Annapolis, he changed for two reasons. On the 24th, he changed the meeting of the legislature from Annapolis to Frederick. I'll explain the various parts of Maryland and how they played into all this. There was a method to his madness. Frederick was a Unionist area of Maryland. You could sort of see where people's sympathies lay by where they were from. But Frederick was solidly Unionist. He also didn't want to call the session, this was his excuse, in Annapolis because Annapolis was the center of the federal camp. This is quite interesting too because the federal government didn't trust Maryland. They moved the Naval Academy to Newport, Rhode Island, while Maryland was in turmoil. And a steamship named the Baltic loaded all the midshipmen up on the USS Constitution and towed them to Newport, Rhode Island. And the Naval Academy remained at Newport, Rhode Island until the war was over. What is the Naval Academy grounds now were a Union hospital. When you go to Parole Shopping Center outside southwest of Annapolis, that was a parole camp. That's another long discussion. But Annapolis was militarized beginning on the 22nd of April. What else happened on the 23rd? Well, James Ryder Randall, who was a Marylander, was a teacher at a school, a small college named Pointers College in Louisiana. He was absolutely inflamed after he read an account of the Baltimore riot. Now think about this. The Baltimore riot was April 19th. Word passed so quickly, things happened so quickly, in a country where the most advanced technology were railroads and telegraphs. And where did people get their information? Newspapers. And newspapers got this out quickly. Broadsides and special editions, and people listened and heeded things from newspapers. What did Ryder Randall do? Well, one of his best friends was Francis X. Ward. And in the New Orleans Delta newspaper, he was listed as mortally wounded at the Baltimore riot. Well, this so inflamed Randall that he wrote an 8-stanza poem entitled My Maryland. It later was put to O Tannenbaum by the two Carey sisters of Baltimore, lived Jenny and forgot the other one. Anyway, it then became Maryland, My Maryland. It was sung a lot. It was sung in Baltimore. It landed the editor of the Baltimore Examiner in prison for publishing the lyrics. It was Maryland state song from the mid-1930s. It was a product of its time. If you ever read it, it harkens Marylanders back to the old line, the Maryland line in the Revolution, Ringgold at Monterey, Carroll, remember Carroll's Sacred Trust, remember Howard's Warlike Trust, all my slumbers with the just. The last lines are, she breathes, she burns, she'll come, as long as she spurns the northern scum. I don't think that endeared it to a lot of people recently, but I found those lyrics kind of interesting. Anyway, that's what Randall wrote. He was inflamed. In our second in our second discussion, I'll tell you about how My Maryland became a song in the war between the states and what role it played in Lee's invasion of Maryland in 1862. April 23rd precedes by 2 days Abraham Lincoln's letter/order to General Winfield Scott as to what to do about whether Maryland's legislature proved to be bellicose, or what would happen if Maryland's legislature took the wrong turn. I have a copy of this letter, and I'll leave it here on the table. It is a typical, if you ever looked at the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln didn't have a florid writing style. It is readable, but when he changed something and thought better of it, he would scratch through it and then write above it, kind of like my college notes. But this was a letter, essentially, it was an order to Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott was the commander-in-chief of the United States Army. He was 75 years old. He was a very effective advisor to Abraham Lincoln at the beginning stages of the war. But in his letter, and I'll get into it, the language a little later, he gave directions to Scott that they must keep Maryland within the Union, and if Maryland adopted any actions that seemed to indicate armed rebellion, that the general and the army were would be directed or allowed to bombard Maryland cities and in extremis suspend habeas corpus. So this says history is boring. This is the Lincoln letter. In fact, I'll pass it around. I also have two other things to pass around, which you can look at while we proceed. One of them is a cockade. Cockades from the colonial times were generally put on hats. By the time of the war between the states, they were like political buttons. This is a blue cockade with a Maryland militia button in the middle of it. It's a reproduction. If this were real, I wouldn't have brought it out. It's a reproduction. This would land you in jail. If it were red and white, it would land you in jail. Because Maryland was divided into 4 military districts very soon after the Baltimore riot. And we're going to get into a timeline so you'll see how quickly all of these things happen. But if you wore this cockade in the streets of Baltimore, then Butler would lock you up. Calder, who succeeded him, would lock you up. Hunter would lock you up. You could go to Fort McHenry and not know what the charges were against you. The other political talisman would be the oath of allegiance. If you wanted to vote in Maryland's legislative and gubernatorial election in November of 1861, and you were somewhat suspect of harboring unloyal or disloyal thoughts, you would be given one of these forms. General Dix insisted on it. Now this one is dated 1865. So some of the language may have changed somewhat, but I'll leave it to you all to read it and see, because by 1865, oath of allegiances were generally given to people who were Confederate prisoners. If you signed an oath of allegiance, you might be able to get out. If you didn't, stay where you were. But by 1861, these were being used, and they were used in the election of 1864 when the unconditional unionist government of Maryland was sort of cemented in again. And in the election of 1864, what happened? Maryland passed a constitution that abolished slavery. 19,000 people, fewer than voted in the 1860 election, voted in the Maryland election of 1864 for the legislature. So there was a substantial disenfranchisement of people as it went along. This is real politics. This is the way the world works. Abraham Lincoln decided that Maryland had to stay in the Union, and he made damn sure it did. This is a botany cross, this little pin. Botany crosses, if you look at the Calvert coat of arms, is the cross. The botany cross was adopted by a number of Marylanders who went south to fight for the Confederacy. They would get a piece of German silver or whatever and pin it on their left breast. If you were to find one of these, it was a Maryland camp in what is now King's Dominion. It was called Camp St. Mary's in 1864. They were trying to organize a Maryland line. So if you found one of the campsites and you found one of these sort of rusty under the ground, they're worth about $3,500. This one is. So this would be the cockade that you might see that would show you southern loyalty. And this is the oath of allegiance that you may be required to sign. Now, with about 3.1 million men under arms in a country as small as the United States was. That means that anybody in this room who had ancestors in that particular time, let's say from the 1840s on, that would have been military age, would have ancestry that fought in the war between the states, whichever side. This is something that the country has to live with, and it's something that we need to understand our history. Why did we choose the notion that Maryland was a house divided? Well, it was. Abraham Lincoln gave a very famous speech in 1858. He was running against Stephen A. Douglas for the Senate for Illinois. And he lifted the phrase from the Gospels, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And Lincoln stated that in the election, a house divided against itself, that is like our country, part slave and part free, cannot stand. Abraham Lincoln went through a lot of metamorphoses. He abhorred slavery, didn't want to end slavery where it existed because he knew it would wreck the Union. Later on, he became a little, or later on he was very effective, but why don't we just say he used his authority to make absolutely sure that the Union would be preserved. But Maryland, more than any other state, lived out the house divided notion, the house divided metaphor of Lincoln. 2 years later, Lincoln lost the senatorial election, by the way. 2 years later, in 1860-61, Maryland was at the crossroads of the impending struggle. And it had men, all ages, dying on both sides of that conflict. What was Maryland? Maryland was a border state. Remember I told you there were like three sort of tiers of people who embraced sort of a southern point of view. The Deep South, which would have been Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, all of the states that seceded with South Carolina, would be the 7 cotton states. These, their sole economy, or their primary economy was planter-based. They relied on slave labor. Made them wealthy, made them prosperous. Maryland was on the other side of that. Maryland was a border state. Border states were Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, and Delaware. Delaware, I lived near Delaware, grew up near Delaware. Delaware doesn't count. I don't care what anybody says. Okay. Delaware, there were about 1,000 slaves in Delaware, enslaved. Kentucky and Missouri had more slaves than Maryland. Maryland, think about this. Maryland almost had a parity. And how do we know this? Well, every 10 years there's a census. And the census of 1860 discloses that Maryland had 87,189 enslaved people, balanced against 83,942 free people. Why was that? Well, Maryland's economy was changing. I'll get into the 4 sections of Maryland. Maryland's sympathies, to a great degree, were Southern oriented. But keep in mind something that's very interesting. The The two Unionist governors of Maryland who kept Maryland in the Union were both slaveholders. Thomas Holliday Hicks, who was buried in Cambridge, right off Cambridge Creek Cemetery, and Augustus Bradford, who was from Baltimore County. Both of them were Unionist slaveholders. So there are contradictions. I had an ancestor in Pickett's charge. He was in the 9th Virginia. He got over the wall. Over the wall. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, it's just a daunting thing to see from Emmitsburg Road to that wall. He was a clerk in Norfolk. He did not own any slaves. The war between the states, there were lots of contributing factors as to why people wanted to fight to preserve the Union or for Southern independence. Don't reach into it and don't make the mistake of making it sort of black and white. It wasn't. And if you read James McPherson's book about why they fought, it'll teach you a lot. It's mostly our community and their community. Our section, our people. Anyway, how was Maryland divided economically and politically? Well, think about it. Southern Maryland was deeply pro-Southern. That would be from Annapolis all the way down to where you cross the Potomac. They had a one-crop sort of economy, tobacco. They were similar to, in outlook, politics, and economy, the states of the Deep South. What was the Eastern Shore? The Eastern Shore was a little different. The Eastern Shore, and we don't have political polling in 1860, so take whatever I say with a grain of salt. You're going to it. But the Eastern Shore was very sympathetic to the South, but it had a sort of a firm Unionist minority. The Eastern Shore's economy was agriculturally based, but it was losing slavery to freed people. I'll go into those statistics. And the Eastern Shore was producing not just single crops, it was growing grain. And it could be cheaper if you were a farmer or a planter to hire labor, to hire free black people, than to maintain a slave population on their property. It was reaching a parity. We'll get into that. But the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland were conservative. They were Democrat. Baltimore City was interesting. Baltimore City had 212,000 people out of a population of around 600,000. So it was about a third of the state's population. Baltimore City maintained about 25,000 people of color who were free and 2,200 who were enslaved. Baltimore, however, was economically aligned with the North and the West. Look at the C&O Canal. That brought grain from the Midwest. And where was it milled? Baltimore. Baltimore had manufacturing. Baltimore had commerce, shipping. Did the Eastern Shore have any of that? No. Did Southern Maryland? No. Baltimore also had populations of immigrants from Europe. The Germans from the revolutions of 1848 and the Irish from the potato famine. I'm a product of some of this. My mom's people were Baltimore Irish. That's why I had to go to Catholic school, we write too much to get knuckles around. My father's people were de Shields. They were Huguenots. They'd been on the Eastern Shore since 16-something. So you'll see that there was a difference. The Eastern Shore Society and Southern Maryland Society were mostly planter-based and with families from colonial times. English, some Scots-Irish, not as many as in the West, and Huguenots. Baltimore had divided loyalties. Baltimore had a number of ties with Virginia that were economic and familial, but the immigrants had no ties to anybody. They were mostly Unionists. You go to Western Maryland. What was Western Maryland? Western Maryland, which I would say would be sort of anything west of Baltimore. If you go to Frederick, Hagerstown, Sharpsburg, heavy German influence. Where did they come from? Some from the revolutions of 1848, but many were settlers who came from Pennsylvania. And they were prosperous. And they had small farms, they had mining, they had not really much in the way of industry. There was little slavery in Western Maryland. If you took all of the counties from Baltimore to the west, there were 5,000 some odd slaves in those particular areas. Now, interestingly enough, many of the people from Western Maryland were Unionists, even if they were slave owners. Odd dichotomy. So the issue of slavery divided this country into its various sections. I talked about the Deep South. What about the Upper South? That would be Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, North Carolina. They were not firebrands for secession the way South Carolina was. Now, I'm not talking about Edmund Ruffin, that guy was a nut. But the Upper South was less inclined to embrace secession. Virginia had 3 tries at it, and Virginia only seceded when Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection. People get all inflated about executive orders these days. Lincoln's proclamation of insurrection was an executive order. There was no declaration of war between the North and the South. Lincoln was too good a lawyer. He knew that you couldn't have a declaration of war because you'd be recognizing another country. So he did it by proclamation. And his proclamation caused the flames of secession to rise in there, where they hadn't as much before. What else happened at that time? Well, let's look at a couple of other states. Missouri, they were sort of sitting there. Kentucky wanted to remain neutral. Kentucky wanted to remain out of the fight. Maryland did as well. Maryland's attitude oftentimes is summed up by let them go. We'll get into that. Paul Callahan, his book is here. I've got 5 or 6 books. Has a real good discussion of what happened in the Maryland legislature in after the Baltimore riots. Real good discussion. And it sort of flops back and forth. It's constant complaining, reports, proclamations, indictments of the Lincoln administration. But in the end, Maryland stayed in the Union. But it didn't stay without a nudge. So what happened? Where did everything start to fall apart? Well, it actually started a year before the election of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah, I'm going to make some pseudo-profound statement, but just bear with me. History is not smooth, it's not like satin. You don't have to rub your hand across it to understand it. It's not symmetrical and it's not easily perceived. Rather, with all things human, it's cut from coarse cloth. Maryland's history of 1860-61 is the coarsest of cloth. And it really, really exhibited what Abraham Lincoln said in 1858. Maryland became, and was throughout that war, a house divided. Now, I'm no great shakes, but James McPherson is. So I'm going to give you two little readings from James McPherson, who is an eminent historian. This comes from Battle Cry of Freedom. James McPherson had people in Gettysburg. They lived there. McPherson's Ridge is on the first day of that battle. James McPherson is no apologist for the South, but he had a very keen understanding of our country's history. And he states, as far as the border states are concerned, in the 4 border states, the proportion of slaves and slave owners was less than half what it was in the 11 states that had seceded. There were only 7 who seceded before or after Lincoln's election, and that would have been in November of 1860. How'd the other 4 get there? Well, secession started, was considered by Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas after Lincoln's call for troops, after it was apparent that he was going to put down the insurrection by force, after they presumed that there would be an invasion of the South. Now you think about this. We regard this country as one solid composite whole. Like Maryland, people in Maryland think that it's one solid composite whole, except people in the Eastern Shore. And we know that we're different. So it speaks well of you to come here. Anyway, he goes on to say, but the triumph of unionism in these states was not easy, and the outcome, except in Delaware, he regards Delaware the same way I do, by no means certain. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri contain large and resolute secessionist minorities. A twist of the chain of events might have enabled this faction to prevail in any of these states. McPherson is no slouch. History oftentimes is of the moment. So, what was the moment? What was the moment where Maryland tried to rise up, or at least parts of it? It's in Baltimore. He goes on. Control of Maryland was even more immediately crucial for the state-enclosed Washington on 3 sides, with Virginia on the 4th, and its allegiance could determine the capital's fate at the outset of the war. Like the border South, Maryland had voted for Breckinridge. That was in the presidential election. He was the pro-Southern, and he had a wink and a nod toward secession. We'll get into that election. In the presidential election, Southern rights Democrats controlled the legislature. Only the stubborn refusal of Governor Thomas Hicks to call the legislature into session forestalled action by that body. That's true. We'll get into the timeline. The tobacco counties of Southern Maryland and the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay were secessionists. The grain-growing counties of northern and western Maryland containing few slaves were safe for the Union. But the loyalty of Baltimore, with a third of the state's population, was suspect. The mayor's unionism was barely tepid, and the police chief sympathized with the South. Confederate flags appeared on many city homes and buildings during the tense days after Sumter. When was Fort Sumter? April 12th and 13th. And Major Anderson left Fort Sumter on the 14th. How many deaths were at Fort Sumter? Zero. One at the end, and it was caused by an accident. General Beauregard permitted Anderson to leave with his colors, with his arms, and his troops. If you've ever been to Charleston, Sumter sits right in the middle of the harbor. And an artillerist named Daniel Huff was killed when in an accident, when a barrel exploded on one of the guns giving 100 guns. Nobody was killed at Sumter. It was after Sumter. He goes into this again. But the loyalty of Baltimore, with a third of the state's population, was suspect. He goes about the mayor. He goes about Confederate flags appearing. The cockades appeared on the streets of Baltimore. Maryland, my Maryland, in broadsides and published in papers, appeared on the streets of Baltimore. There were Confederate recruiting offices in Baltimore, and they weren't shut down until May. The traditional role of mobs in Baltimore politics, and that's true, created a volatile situation. Only a spark was needed to ignite the state's secessionists. Such a spark hit the streets of Baltimore on April 19th, the Baltimore riot. That is as close as Maryland, that and maybe 3 or 4 days after that was as close as Maryland would ever come. This is the 6th Massachusetts, and you'll see they were throwing paving stones at the Union soldiers, at the Massachusetts troops. If you look at contemporary accounts, a lot of people considered the route of federal troops, federalized northern militia through Baltimore, to be a threat to Maryland, to Maryland's independence, and a threat of invasion of the South. Even Unionist Marylanders did not want to see that war come in that fashion. I have two things that are very interesting. This is called a cult police model. Lots of these went to the gold fields. They made $250 million of these damn things. There were pistol shots fired by the crowd at the unionized militia. Paving stones. They threw paving stones. If you've ever been to Baltimore, and you'll see that when I was in law school there, the mechanics, sometimes when they would tear the streets up and work on them, what's under the macadam? About 6 inches deep. This is what was there.
Is that the same as a cobblestone? You would call it cobblestone?
Paving stones, cobblestones. That is not a Baltimore cobblestone. That is a piece of ballast that I got on the Tread Avenue River, and I know where lots of it is. But that is the size of a cobblestone. And they were bigger as well. What happened in that riot? Well, let's back up. The seminal question in the spring of 1861 in Maryland was, would Maryland secede? Or could Maryland secede? That was a political question. And the flow of events and temper of the time lead me to believe that McPherson was exactly right. After the flashpoint of the Baltimore riot, Maryland could have moved towards secession, but it was prevented by two things: timing and bayonets. The recalcitrance and resolution of two men kept Maryland firmly in the Union. Governor Thomas Holiday Hicks was a recalcitrant one, and Abraham Lincoln, the president, aided by a healthy sprinkling of Union troops, kept Maryland in the Union. In the end, would have, could have, Maryland could not have seceded. It would have been impossible. Now, we'll begin sort of at the end. Maryland's divided sympathies, as identified by McPherson, were personified by the two men I just disclosed to you. Thomas Holiday Hicks, Maryland's Unionist governor and a slave lawyer, had a policy of masterly inactivity. Very interesting. Hicks ignored pleas to convene the legislature right after the presidential election. That's what started the firestorm in the Deep South. The election of Abraham Lincoln. He went on to only calling the legislature into session when he couldn't avoid it any further. Now, how do you secede? Well, the legislature itself couldn't secede. What they could do is appoint what they call a sovereign committee to consider it and then put the issue to a vote of the people. That's how it was done in Virginia. That's how it was done in most of the southern states that seceded. They never got past that. They never appointed a sovereign commission. In the meantime, after the state began to be occupied militarily, Hicks dithered and cajoled, told the secessionists or the pro-Southern people what they wanted to hear, but still held off. He ultimately had all of the arms, all the states had to supply their own weapons. The Militia Act of 1808, the federal government would give you arms for your militia. There was an armory in Easton. It's behind Washington Street. It was not an arsenal. An arsenal is where they build the weapons. An armory is where they store them. But what did he do? Well, in May of 1861, Hicks had all of the arms in downtown Easton who could have armed, let's say, anybody, pro-Union, pro-Southern militia, sent to Fort McHenry. What was Fort McHenry? Fort McHenry was a federal fort. It maintained a Union military presence way before the war and throughout the war. So he disarmed the militia. At that particular time, too, he also had a number of arms distributed to pro-Unionist militia in Frederick and Hagerstown. So he put his finger on the scale. Later, he embraced military occupation of Maryland. He said absolutely nothing to speak of about the suspension of habeas corpus. And he cooperated very firmly with the Union General John Adams Dix, who ultimately took over Maryland in the summer of 1861, and also helped make certain that the unconditional Unionist Party in Maryland won the 1861 elections. Maryland was really a weird state politically. You had a 4-year term for the governor, but the legislature just met like once or twice, or in special session when the governor called them. When the hue and cry arose after the election of 1860, the presidential election, when the hue and cry was from the secessionist elements in Maryland about Abraham Lincoln, He did nothing. He sort of stalled them. He refused to speak to any of the commissioners of any of these newly formed Confederate states. That would have been in February, March. And he did try to back what they call a Virginia peace movement. There are 21 states that backed certain compromises between the North and the South that met in Washington. And what they wanted was something similar to the Crittenden Compromise, which was essentially preserve and allow slavery where it was, enforce fusion of slave laws. That goes well afield. But it went nowhere. And the Maryland kept an eye on it, and there was a Maryland convention of very influential people who were watching that peace convention to see what would happen. And they were watching to see what Virginia would do. Maryland and Virginia were aligned very closely politically, at least the southern leaning elements of it. Virginia refused 2 or 3 different secession pushes in the spring of 1861, and only brought the measure to their state convention after the call for volunteers, at which time Virginia formally seceded from the Union in late May of 1861 and let the people vote. Robert E. Lee disfavored secession. He thought it was madness, but he sided with his state. That's the way a lot of people felt in those days. Similar to the way that people will take an area where they live and adopt. Dan Toomey, who's a great Maryland historian, he has Toomey Press. He wrote a very nice little book called The Civil War in Maryland. He wrote about 10 books about Maryland. And he summed it up better than I will ever be able to do it. When the nation was torn apart, Marylanders had a decision to make. If you were from Vermont, who would you back? Who would you sign up for? Who would you fight for? Your state, your region. If you were from Alabama or Mississippi, same side of the coin. Virginia, a little bit different, because western counties of Virginia split off. They called that Western. The western counties became West Virginia in 1863. But all the tidewater areas of Virginia you were Virginians. You'd fight for the South. What would you do in Maryland? You had a choice to make. Families were divided. It was a war of brother against brother, in its strictest sense. Now, we've gone through the issue of slavery, or at least slavery as it existed in Maryland. This is an interesting point. 5 counties on the eastern shore, Dorchester, Kent, Queen Anne, Somerset, Talbot, and Worcester, all had more slaves per county than Baltimore City. On the eastern shore, you may find, or be surprised to find out, that there were more free persons of color than there were slaves. There were 24,708 people of color who were free, 21,309 who were enslaved. Queen Anne's, Somerset, and Talbot had the most proportionate enslaved to free Black people. Caroline had very few, Cecil very few, Dorchester almost even, and Kent more free persons. The other border states, Missouri had 114,931, and Kentucky 225,483. Now, I told you that before you go into the election of Abraham Lincoln, there was a pebble in the road that caused this country to stumble. That was John Brown's raid. John Brown's raid, and that is the subject of 2 more lectures. John Brown's raid galvanized a sectional hatred that sort of broke on the shores of the 1860 presidential election. John Brown and 21 followers. John Brown was well known from Bloody Kansas. This is from the Kansas-Nebraska Act. There were like 4 major compromises between who would be slave, who would be free states. The parity of who controlled Congress was very important at that time. In 1860, there were 19 free states and 15 slave states. This went into consideration of tariff policies, trade policies, public works, things of that nature. The South had a very firm hold on national politics, almost from the beginning, from the Revolutionary period, because look at all the presidents who were from Virginia. They were losing their grip, and the more populous states of the North, more prosperous, you spread it out with railroads, manufacturing, commerce against an agrarian economy. There was a dichotomy there. Brown killed, he and his followers were financed through a number of immigrant aid societies. And during the guerrilla war that happened in Kansas, he and his sons and other followers killed 5 men that they dragged out of their homes in Potawatomi, Kansas. And he said they weren't good enough to shoot. He killed them with swords. Their families were there. Now, that gets in the newspapers. What do you think that's going to do? Brown was an active, aggressive, and militant abolitionist. Frederick Douglass, when he heard of Brown's plans, met Brown, that is, as far as taking the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Brown wanted to take Harper's Ferry because why? The bees. This is the state of the art for military arms in the United States. It's a model 1855 rifle musket. It had rifling, you can sort of feel it, which was state of the art from the Crimean Wars. It was effective from 300 to 500 yards, where old smoothbore muskets were only effective for about 100 yards. This one is dated 1858. There were 100,000 arms at Harper's Ferry in 1859 when Brown raided it. This, in all likelihood, being a later version of it, was probably there. Soon after that raid, the militias on both sides of the Potomac River were given arms. Lots of these went north, lots of them went south. This country was a tinderbox. That particular one with that date, in all likelihood, was at Harper's Ferry. What did Brown want to do? Brown wanted to cause a servile insurrection. He wanted to grab an area in the Appalachians for a slave republic. Well, what happened after that? They went to the Kennedy Farm, that is when, just before Brown was hanged. Kennedy Farm is near Burkittsville, Maryland. It's where he staged his raid, where he stored 950 pikes that he would use. Very few slaves, maybe 2, joined his revolt. It was put down in a day and a half. Maryland contributed to that. Maryland brought 4 companies of militia to block Brown's escape. Virginia had militia to block their escape on the Virginia side of the Potomac. Maryland then authorized $70,000 to rearm the state's militias. And armed insurrection, when you started killing people back and forth, that got their attention. And what did it do too? It further divided this country. Oh, by the way, Frederick Douglass, when he met with Brown in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, said, "This is suicide. Don't do it." Now, Frederick Douglass had started out his speeches with regard to evils of slavery on biblical grounds. And then he moved over to constitutional grounds. He adopted a lot of the language from the Declaration of Independence. But by 1859, he was willing to embrace the notion of insurrection, flaming sword. But he knew madness when he saw it. When people investigating that raid went to the Kennedy farm, they found extensive correspondence from Brown and the Secret Six, who were mostly Unitarian ministers and financiers in the North who backed his revolt. But to them, slaveholders could be killed in their beds. Now, what does that do? It inflames people. What happened then? Well, Abraham Lincoln, unfortunately, was more a moderate. He didn't want to, he wanted to retain the Union. He wanted to, in his first address to the nation, his inaugural address, you remember the line, "The better angels of our natures"? It's brilliant. He wanted conciliation, but he was firm. He was going to uphold the Union. That was going to be his firm purpose. Unfortunately, by that point, it was too late for a lot of the states in the Deep South. It wasn't too late for Maryland, though. Maryland wanted there to be a compromise. Maryland wanted to remain in the Union. Maryland wanted the continuation of slavery, but under constitutional grounds that had been supported in the past. But Maryland did not want to secede. Portions of Maryland did. Now, that was the flashpoint. What happened after Brown's raid? The election of 1860 saw the destruction of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was both North and South, but then it split. The Democratic Party of John C. Breckinridge, who had been the Vice President of the United States, was bent on Southern rights, slavery, and hinted at secession. The National Democrats, that was Stephen A. Douglas's party. And Douglas was in favor of popular sovereignty, that is, in the Kansas-Nebraska area, vote for what you want. But he was also perceived as being a Northerner. He garnered very few votes in Maryland. The Constitutional Union Party, which was John Bell of Tennessee, was a moderate Southern party. It said, preserve and protect slavery where it is. Let's compromise. Let's don't take it too far. Then there was the Republican Party. The Republican Party was multifaceted at that time. It would have been New England abolitionists, people from the old Northwest, that would be Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and a plurality of issues. They range from stop the spread of slavery through votes to abolish slavery outright, and it contained former Democrats, Whigs, and Know-Nothings. What was a Know-Nothing? A Know-Nothing was the American Party. They were anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and when people would ask them what they believed, what's your party, they said, I know nothing. Thomas Holiday Hicks was a Know-Nothing. He was probably, Maryland's politics were kind of weird, but at the end, that's what ended. the Know Nothing Party sort of ended at the beginning of the Civil War. So you've got the setup to the election. And Abraham Lincoln was elected 37% of the popular vote, and he only received 2.5% of Maryland's votes. He did not have any electoral votes south of Maryland, or south. He won basically on a northern vote. But he did poll 1,855,276 votes. That was 1 million less than all the other parties arrayed against him. But he was a president by plurality. How did they fare in Maryland? Breckinridge, who was the ardent Southern secessionist type candidate, polled 42,282 votes, or 45.8% of Maryland's electorate. Bell, who was the moderate Southern candidate, but stay in the Union, almost equal, 41,760 votes. Douglas only got 6.5% of Maryland's votes. Lincoln received 2,294 votes. The Eastern Shore, total votes on the counties of the Eastern Shore were 19,642 votes. Guess how many Lincoln got? Lincoln got 251 of those 19,000 votes. When you take out Cecil County, if you go up, now I say it like a Marylander, not like an Englishman, I don't say Cecil. But you go up to Cecil County, they had the highest number of votes for Lincoln on the Eastern Shore, 158 votes. You take Cecil County bordered Pennsylvania. How many votes did Lincoln garner on the shore? 95 votes. How many did he get in Talbot County? He got this many in Somerset, he got this many in Queen Anne's, and he got that many in Worcester. There was practically no abolitionist party in there. Lincoln's votes basically came from Western Maryland and Baltimore State. That's where the majority of them came. Now, after that, South Carolina seceded. They seceded on December 20th, 1861. And before they seceded, they asked the various slave states, which included border states, Upper South, and the Deep South, to send delegates to a convention to devise a means to defend themselves against Northern aggression and consider the question of seceding from the Union. What did the Maryland legislature say? It's very interesting. This would have been before December 20th, 1860. The Maryland legislature stated that its fixed determination was to cling to the Union so long as its principles can be preserved. But it went on to assure, quote, our brethren of South Carolina, that should the hour ever arrive when the Union must be dissolved, Maryland will cast her lot with her sister states of the South and abide their fortune to the fullest extent. Mixed message, but it was Maryland's message. Maryland wasn't for secession initially. Virginia wasn't either. Would Maryland have seceded? Probably not, if you sort of want to guess at the numbers. But that flashpoint in Baltimore was very interesting. And the flashpoint in Baltimore was in reaction to Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection. That's what inflamed people. What happened in Baltimore? I'm going to read you a couple of statements. And then we get through the, oh my goodness, talk to me. I'll read you a couple of statements from the riot. They're fascinating. With regard to the legislature, I would point you to Paul's book, which goes through the various sessions of the Maryland legislature beginning in April 26th to, I think it was June 2nd, and then, late May, then June 2nd to June 22nd, and then the third one ended, I think, August the 6th. But there were a number of resolutions where the Maryland legislature decried Lincoln's action to activate the Northern Militia as unconstitutional, the military occupation of the state of Maryland as unconstitutional, the suspension of habeas corpus is unconstitutional. Toward the end, in August, they were saying that the Lincoln administration was being tyrannical. They used the word despotic. Figure all of that. That wasn't really endearing because on September 17th, they arrested a third of them so that they couldn't have a quorum in September. The call for volunteers is very interesting. President Lincoln said, "Now therefore, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, in virtue of the power in me vested by the Constitution and the laws, have thought fit to call forth and hereby do call forth a militia of the several states of the Union in the aggregate number of 75,000 in order to suppress said combination and to cause the laws to be duly executed. The details for this object will be immediately communicated to the state authorities through the war." Maryland was called on by Secretary of War Cameron, consequently, to produce 4 regiments of militia to subdue insurrection. Same for Kentucky, same for Missouri. Governor Hicks didn't respond to that request. He told the Lincoln administration that it would be futile at that point. These are some of the statements that were made at the time of the Baltimore riot, as close as that would ever be. What happened right after the Baltimore riot? Telegraph lines between Baltimore and Philadelphia were cut. There was no communication to the north. It was sporadic. 4 railroad bridges were burned north of Baltimore, Gunpowder River and 3 others. Burned. They were burned on the 19th and on the 20th. There was militia called up all over the state. Some of it went to Baltimore to defend Baltimore, to defend the state. That's as close as they would ever get. On April the 20th, little Ben Butler, who we'll show you a picture of, 8th Massachusetts, came to Perryville at the head of the bay. They called him Beast Butler in New Orleans. He also occupied New Orleans in 1862. And a man pulled an American flag down by the post office and started raising a Confederate flag. Union Army was well in control of New Orleans at that time. But for that act of civil disobedience, Butler had it hanged. Butler was also called Spoons Butler because he stole lots of silver spoons in New Orleans. Let's just back up. This riot is fascinating. And if you could show Mayor Brown, George Brown was the mayor of Baltimore. He was tempted in his unionism, but he tried to keep the peace. He was arrested by General Hunter's people on September 13th, 1861. Spent 14 months in Fort Warren, that's in the harbor Boston. No charges were ever placed against him. That's habeas corpus, that's another lecture. You can also show Kane, the police commissioner. George Kane was a police marshal of police in Baltimore. His policemen helped protect the 6th Massachusetts when the riots started. Go to the next frame. That is John Singleton Mosby. You've heard of Mosby's Confederacy in Loudon, Virginia, Mosby's Rangers. This is a picture of a number of his Marylanders after the war between the states who came to Baltimore and had photographs taken. Some of these men, I don't know if they were there in that picture, but 2 of his men were Marshall Kane's sons. Now, this is George William Brown's recitation of what happened on April 19th. When the Union troops started to come through Baltimore, on the 18th, there was unarmed Pennsylvania militia who were in their trains, and the trains were stoned. Why would somebody be able to stone a train? Well, Baltimore's transportation and its politics were odd. You have the President Street Station, where all the traffic from the north came, the Northern Central Railroad. That was their terminus. Then you had Camden Street Station. That was the beginning of the B&O Railroad. So for the 1 mile between President Street Station to Camden Station, tracks were laid in Baltimore on Pratt Street for that 1 mile. And the cars were drawn by horses from the Northern Station at President Street to Camden Station to go south. Now, in the meantime, on the 19th, the Union colonel in charge of the 6th Massachusetts, there were about 700 of them, told the men to load their rifles at Cockeysville coming into Baltimore, and they did. And what kind of rifles did they have? It's like this. And they came through Baltimore, and the riot began because so many of the citizens were inflamed that there were troops passing through Baltimore and invading Maryland to invade the South. Mayor Brown recited that by the time he had gotten there had been some commotion. Later, people had drawn anchors and dumped anchors from the harbor, because you're right near Baltimore Harbor, and sand on those railroad tracks, so that the horses couldn't draw the last cars up. There were 4 companies of troops. Generally, there would be 10 companies to a regiment. So the last 4, the tracks were torn. The tracks weren't torn up. They were covered with anchors, sand. They couldn't draw their cars. So the soldiers had to go back to President Street Station, detrain, form ranks, and then march the 1 mile. And that's when the Baltimore riot occurred. People were throwing paving stones at them. There would be random pistol shots. And these men were armed with 58 caliber muskets. It was madness. But Brown said, in all, about 220 men formed on President Street in the midst of a dense and angry crowd, which threatened and pressed upon the troops, uttering cheers for Jefferson Davis and the Southern Confederacy and groans for Lincoln and the North, with much abusive language. As the soldiers advanced along President Street, the commotion increased. One of the band of rioters appeared bearing a Confederate flag and tried to lead them. They got knocked out. William Bowley Wilson, who was a member of the Baltimore militia group, stated that believing firmly the government had no right to coerce the southern states, and it was outraging the state of Maryland for bringing northern militia through it for that purpose. I ran down to the depot to assist in preventing their passage. I found a large and angry crowd gathered outside, some thousands. The 6th Massachusetts were drawn up in 2 ranks on the north of the station just outside. They had unwisely allowed the crowd to surround them so closely that the men of the regiment would have been unable to use their arms in case of an attack. There were people of all sorts in the crowd, and it was no common mob, most of them with my feelings, I imagine. Henry Wagner, a businessman, was carrying checks to South Street in Baltimore to another of his business location. Several carloads of soldiers passing westward on Pratt Street with an excited and angry crowd of men and boys at the side of them, following the cars, throwing sticks, stones, and hurling approbations, epithets at the soldiers, declaring vehemently that no Yankees should be allowed to pass through the city of Baltimore to war upon the South. No shots were heard, but missiles were thrown into the car windows, which were open. Brown went on to say that when I was about to leave Camden Street Station, supposing all danger to be over, news was brought to Police Commissioner Davis and myself, who were standing together, that some troops had been left behind and that the mob was tearing up the track on Pratt Street. He continued, I saw a battalion which proved to be 4 companies of the Massachusetts Regiment, which had crossed the ridge, coming towards me in double quick time. They were firing wildly, sometimes backward over their shoulders. So rapid was their march that they could not stop to take aim. The mob, which was not very large, as it seemed to me, was pursuing with shouts and stones. I think an occasional pistol shot. The uproar was furious. Finally stated, at the corner of South Street, several citizens standing in a group fell, either killed or wounded. It was impossible for the troops to discriminate between the rioters and the bystanders, but the latter seemed to suffer more because its main attack was from the mob pursuing the soldiers from the rear. Then there was an account of a businessman, Richard Fisher, who recited some of the same things I've stated, but it's very cryptic at the end. I well remember that standing beside me, this was after he'd seen the firing and the tumult. I well remember that standing beside me was a Spanish sea captain, whose vessel was then in port to my consignment, and who said to me in Spanish, quote, "You seem much agitated. This is nothing. We frequently have these things in Spain." And I replied, in Spain, this may mean nothing. In America, it means civil war.
Yeah.
Police Marshal Kane had formed a double line of police officers in the last 2 or 3 companies to keep the mob away from the federal troops, from the Massachusetts troops. But Kane was an ardent Southern sympathizer. And he wrote to Bradley Johnson, and he sent him a telegram. If you could show who Johnson is, I think he's further on. Bradley Johnson was a power in the Maryland Democratic Party. He was an editor of a newspaper in Frederick and also was a lawyer. After the war between the states, he lived in Virginia for about 10 years, came back to Maryland and practiced law in Baltimore. He became the president of the Maryland Bar Association. You can go on to the next one, which would be John Kennedy. John Kennedy, yeah. Think back to Bradley Johnson, ardent secessionist Frederick. John Kennedy was an attorney in Baltimore. John Kennedy was a unionist. John Kennedy helped raise the first Maryland Volunteers. John Kennedy, there were 4 regiments that were being raised in Maryland to support the Union from like May and June of 1861. John Kennedy and Bradley Johnson's paths would cross. In the Shenandoah Valley campaign of Stonewall Jackson, the first Maryland Confederates under Bradley captured the first Maryland Volunteers, John Kennedy, outside of our front row of Virginia. And the sad thing is that a lot of them knew each other. Anyway, Police Commissioner Kane sent this to to Bradley Johnson, who was a militia captain in Frederick. This was the same day, April 19th. Bring your men by the first train. Streets red with Maryland blood. Send expresses over the mountains of Maryland and Virginia for the riflemen to come without delay. Fresh hordes will be down on us tomorrow. We will fight them and whip them or die. There was a flyer put out by the Baltimore Republican. It was a newspaper. It was later closed. And it states, and this was on the 19th, the work of destruction commenced. Our citizens shot down by the ruffian black Republicans. Our streets drenched with blood by Lincoln's hirelings. A foreign soldiery passing through. Murder of Baltimoreans. 13 citizens shot. There were 12 Baltimore residents killed. And they don't have the number. There were 36 of these 6 Massachusetts wounded and four killed. 4 of the military killed. They did get that right. The populace in arms, the military organized, and the people of Maryland rise to the rescue. These are things that were being said at that time. Benjamin Butler came down to Chesapeake Bay from Perryville on a ferry boat, and he landed outside of Annapolis on the 22nd and demanded to come ashore. Aside from the 6 Massachusetts that left Baltimore by train when they got to the Camden Street station and went on, his was the 2nd Regiment, the 8th Massachusetts that got through. And then the 7th New York, which is a very well-drilled militia group. That was the military presence in Maryland. After that, he got in trouble with Winfield Scott because he took Baltimore. He was at Relay House, which was a train station southwest of Baltimore. And he went into Baltimore on May 13th in a thunderstorm. Nobody knew what he was doing. He landed at Camden Yards. He marched his troops up Federal Hill. If you've ever been to Baltimore, Federal Hill. And he had a battery of artillery. What did he do? He pointed at Baltimore. Do you remember what Lincoln said to Scott? Scott transmitted that order to Butler. Butler had artillery aimed at Baltimore on the 13th. Very soon after that, Unionist sentiment rose. Flame of secession was sort of being scotched. There were arrests made without charges. Ray Merriman, which is another lecturer, was a very famous case where it was found that the military government would not permit the habeas corpus to allow people to know what they were charged with or what they were raised on. This all happened, and it was as close of a whisper. Abraham Lincoln was able to control the state militarily. Once again, she gave him a lollipop. He gives a very good discussion of Maryland's constitutional arguments through their legislature that were very insulting toward the Lincoln administration. And finally, it sort of ends with Secretary of War Cameron instructed the General Hunter, who at that time was in charge of Maryland, if anything else happens, prevent them from having a quorum. And they locked up a third of the legislature in Frederick. Beginning of the 13th of September, when they arrested the mayor, they'd already arrested Kane and the police commissioners. They were not be permitted to secede. Why did they do that? Why did they do that? The state was controlled by the military. First Manassas, first Bull Run, depending on the side of it. That was July 21st, 1861. That was a battle that Lincoln forced General McDowell, his general, who said that his troops were too green, they couldn't fight. Lincoln said, they're green, you're green, we're all green together. McDowell went west. Beauregard and Belfort defeated him. The Union Army was sent rolling back into Washington. That scared the Lincoln administration. They were afraid of Confederate troops just across the Potomac River that the legislature may secede. Finally, the last thing, there were 9 papers. That's another one. 9 papers in Baltimore. How many were left at the end of the war? 3. 3 of the, I'm sorry, not 9, there were 12. 9 were closed. Lots of editors were sent south, lots of editors. The press is destroyed. Fourth estate, what happened, that's another discussion entirely. Now, it's going to get a lot of but anybody who guesses. Camden Yards. What was Camden Yards? Where was Camden Yards? Everybody ever been there?
Sure.
Camden Yards is the rail yard for the B&O Railway. What 3 events in that war of note happened at Camden Street Station with Camden Yards? Anybody name all 3 of them?
Didn't the Confederates come up and steal a locomotive?
No, that would have been in Shenandoah Valley. Here's the 3.
They can pass through the city.
Yeah, I think, didn't Lincoln go there?
Lincoln passed through
Yeah.
Baltimore, February 23rd, on his way to Washington. He went through Camden Yards between 3 in the morning and 6 in the morning.
What disaster.
Second one was the Baltimore Run. What was the third?
Going back.
This is,
It's when the Colts were taken out of the Second World War.
you get the lollipop because the store was closed down. And it's a sad and poignant reminder of something in that war.
Repeat what it was, what was the third point? You didn't have.
Abraham Lincoln was assassinated.
Oh, right, okay, fine.
On May 14th, 1865. The first stop on, sorry, it's assassinated on April 14th, 1865. The first stop on his trip back to Springfield, Illinois,
Right.
was April 21st, 1865, in Baltimore. Detrained at Camden Yard in Land State. That was 4 years, almost to the day, of the Baltimore riots.
Wow.
So there's a lot of poignancy, and we share a history that's rather sad. That's it.
Thank you.